Imagine being sold to slavery not for money, but for a face mirror or an umbrella. Imagine someone looking at you and deciding that your life was worth one umbrella. Sounds crazy, right? This was part of the horrifying reality of the transatlantic slave trade during this slave trade era. Something happened that is still difficult to believe till today. Human beings were exchanged for things like gin, mirror, umbrellas, and other European goods. Yes, human beings. Imagine hearing that one umbrella could be exchanged for 40 enslaved people, 40 human beings. This happened during the period when the slave trade was flourishing along the West African coast, and Badagry became one of the most important places connected to this horrible trade. You might be wondering, did they just enter Nigeria and start slave trading? No, they did not arrive in Nigeria by marching into the country with an army. They did not just say, we are Europeans, we are coming over to take your place. No, they started as traders. But before the Europeans, our people were already trading. They were already marketing traders. They were already different kingdoms and community trading with one another. People traded things like gold, salt, food, livestock, and other goods. But then you might be wondering, how did the Europeans even communicate with our people? Because obviously they can't speak in their own language. They didn't arrive speaking Yoruba, Hausa, Igbo, and all of that. At the beginning, the communication was not that easy. They had to rely on gestures, basic words, and interpreters, and African traders who could communicate with both sides. As the Europeans kept coming back to the coast, as they started doing business with us, some Africans learned European languages. Why? Some Europeans and their representatives learned local languages. Little by little, they were able to communicate better, and they made trade easier. Now, imagine the European trader arriving on the coast with goods from Europe. Things like clothes, beads, metal items, alcohol, and so many other things. But he doesn't know everybody inland. He doesn't know the different markets. He doesn't know the different languages. Who does the deal with him? African traders and the middlemen. These people already knew the trading routes. They knew the different communities. They knew what people wanted. They knew where different goods could be found. So the Europeans gradually became connected to the trading networks that were already existing. And this is where things started to change. At first, the Europeans were interested in things like gold, ivory, and other valuable commodities. But then the Europeans established colonies across the Atlantic. And those colonies needed a huge number of people to work on plantation. They wanted labor. And suddenly the demand for enslaved Africans became enormous. This changed the trade. The Europeans began bringing goods that could be exchanged in the African markets. Things like guns, gunpowder, alcohol, clothes, beads, and on the other side of the transaction was captives, people, human beings. They now established a relationship and made friends. They presented their interests, and some of our people accepted and started creating their network at different states. The Europeans merchant might be sitting at the Badagry, but the person being sold could have come from a very far distance. That is how the trade penetrated deeper into the region. European traders didn't necessarily have to travel to different kingdoms and communities to find their captives. They have insiders working for them. Badagry became a major meeting point. It was perfectly positioned because waterways made it possible for people and goods to move between coast and inland communities. Brekete's slave market was established in 1502 and became a meeting point for European slave merchants, African middlemen, and captives brought from the interland. At that time, when European traders came to Africa, some people who couldn't afford what they had wanted it by all means. Things like mirrors, umbrellas, beads, ceramics plates, brass items, clothes, alcohol, weapons, so many other things. And these things were not ordinary to everyone. An umbrella, for an example, was not just something you carried when it was raining. it was a symbol of power and royalty. You could see some important kings and chiefs under beautiful decorated umbrellas. So anyone could show that you are wealthy and powerful. And according to historical accounts, one such umbrella could be exchanged for 40 enslaved people. 40. One umbrella on one side, 40 human beings on the other side, and the exchange could happen. Mirrors were also highly valued. Imagine living in a society where you've never seen your face before. A glass mirror being suddenly given to you to look at yourself. You look into it and see your own face staring back at you. To some people, this important object appears strange, beautiful, and almost magical. Mirrors were exchanged for enslaved people, and it wasn't only luxury items. European traders brought gin, schnapps, and other alcoholic drinks. They brought guns and gunpowders. And these goods became part of a trade that was turning human lives into commodities. Now you might be wondering, why didn't they just use money? Why didn't these people request for money? At that time, many of the transactions were done through trade by barter. Slave trade did not always operate like the normal buying and selling we know of today. So imagine this. One person brings an umbrella, another person brings human beings. They negotiated, agree on the exchange, and the transaction is being done, trade by barter. But European traders brought goods from Europe and often exchanged those goods through African intermediaries for captives. So instead of saying, give me 100 calories and I will give you a human being, negotiation could be based on goods, a certain quantity of guns, a certain amount of alcohol, textile, beads, mirrors, umbrellas, and so many other goods, all in exchange for human being. Europeans were not only bringing luxury items, they were bringing weapons that could be used in wars and raids. A community could attack another community, capture people, and those captives could then be sold to slave traders. The traders would give them guns, gunpowder, and other goods in return, and those weapons could then be used to capture more people. So the cycle continued. War, capture, slavery, weapons, more war, more capture, more slavery. It was just a vicious cycle. For being captured were not numbers. They were father, mother, children, brothers, sisters, and people who had families waiting for them, people who had names, people who had homes, people who had lives. But once they were captured and taken into the slave trade, these things could disappear. They became part of a transaction. In Badagry, many of the captives were brought from the inland areas before being taken to the coast. Some were captured during the wars, some were victims of raids, others were kidnapped or caught up in a political conflict. They were marched towards the slave markets. One of the places associated with this trade was the Vekete slave market. From there, many captives were eventually taken through routes leading towards the Atlantic coast. And then came one of the most painful parts of the journey. They were taken to holding places known as barracoons. Imagine being locked inside a small space with many other people. You don't know where you are going. You don't know what is going to happen to you, if you will ever see your family again. And eventually, you are taken towards the coast. Once many captives reached that point and were taken onto ships, they were being sent across the Atlantic. Many would never return to Africa. They were transported to the Americas, where they were forced into brutal labor. Families were separated. Children were separated from parents. People were beaten. People were abused. And countless people died along the way. And when you visit places like the William Abbas museum in Badagry today, you can see some of the physical reminders of these histories. You can see the chains, cells, the old objects, the places where people were held, and then you remember the umbrella, an ordinary looking umbrella today. But according to the historical accounts surrounding the Badagry slave trade, an umbrella could once represent the price of 40 human beings, 40 lives, 40 stories, 40 families, all reduced to a transaction. And that is what made the history so painful, because these people were never commodities. They were human beings. The mirror didn't have more value than them. Umbrella didn't have more value than them. Didn't have value more than them, but the system treated them as if they did. And that is a part of the history that we must never forget, because when you stand in Badagry today and look, all those old chains and cells you are just looking at are objects from the past. We are looking at reminders of what happens to real people, people who had names, people who had families, people who had dreams, people who deserve to be free.